So hello, everyone. Welcome to this Friday Fireside Chat. I'm Rita McGrath. You probably knew that. And with me this week is Marcus Eriksen, who is an environmental scientist, an author, a filmmaker, an adventurer. He's really a polymath on all kinds of things. And I met Marcus at an event which brought together artists, business people, scientists, all kinds of different things, and just found his perspective absolutely fascinating, and just wanted to kind of get the word out to the world. So Marcus, welcome.
Thank you, Rita. Yes, good morning.
Good morning. So for those that don't know you, maybe tell us a little bit about your journey, because it's a long way from being in the first Gulf War to doing what you're doing now.
Yes, and I'll try and keep it short. Yes, a long journey. I grew up in Louisiana. If you ever fly into New Orleans and you see swamp beneath the airplane before you land, that was my stomping grounds as a kid, catching snakes and turtles. I remember catching a 4-foot alligator as a plane was landing right there at that swamp. But that began my conservation ethic, and I joined the Marines, soon after, thinking about public service. I had this love of nature, love of the outdoors. The whole survival mentality was very much in the forefront of my mind. So I joined the Marines, and I found myself, years later in the first Gulf War. If you remember all the burning oil wells in Kuwait as the Iraqi army left that city, left behind this wake of burning wells, I was one of the Marines on the ground among those wells. I remember sitting in a foxhole, a hole in the sand, covered in just soot and oil drops. And I remember seeing the residue of the black around my face and my eyes and my nose, and talking to a Marine next to me. We're both from New Orleans, and we're saying, if we survive this mess, let's build a raft, like Tom Sawyer, Huck Finn. Like, I couldn't find that Marine 13 years later, but I built my raft. I just finished my PhD. I had no more school, no more job, no house, no kids. Time to go rafting. So I built a raft, and I spent 5 months on the Mississippi River. And the most amazing journey, through the United States. And
5 months on a raft, like with just wind and paddles and things.
Yeah. Actually, I made the raft wide enough to fit in the back of a 40 Econoline van. It's the van that I had, and I had a friend drop me off in Lake Itasca, and I thought I might see him in a couple months. 5 months later, I'd come hobbling into New Orleans on this raft I called the Bottle Rocket. It was made of 232 2-liter plastic bottles. And I didn't know that was kind of ironic, because my career ended up chasing plastic bottles around the world. I saw so much trash on the Mississippi River. And it just occurred to me, in that time in the river, I fell in love with the river. I rekindled my love of nature and my belief in the basic goodness of humanity, which I kind of lost in that time since the Gulf War. I had so many people who were just good to me, helped me fix my raft. I had a welder pull my raft out and weld a new little anchor pin on my raft. And people fed me, gave me clothing, just amazing. So when I saw this assault of plastic trash, it shifted my career. I had to study this. I met the man, discovered the Great Pacific Garbage Patch in the ocean. I ended up working with him. Within a few weeks, I had a job. I actually brought my raft to his doorstep in Long Beach, California. And I got this job working on plastics, and that began my career, really focused on what are the solutions. First of all, identifying the problem. You have to use science as a foundation for decision making. If you're not working with the same facts, as we know from recent times, you're not going to get anywhere. You're not going to get to a unified sense of truth and direction. So I chose a path of science. And our organization has taken that and brought it to policymakers, brought it to the private sector, and that's when we see real change happen.
So you have two companies. One is called the Five Gyres Institute, and the other one is Leap Lab. And yes. How are they different? What do they do?
Well, the Five Gyres Institute. When I met my wife, Anna Cummins, we both joined, Captain Charles Moore at sea to go see the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. And I found her sleeping in the sails one day, actually February 14th, 2008. and I proposed. I found some rope floating in the ocean, a little piece of trash fishing line. I made a ring and proposed and said, "Don't have to answer now. We can wait till we're on land." But she said yes, and we began the Five Gyres Institute because we realized, okay, we're in the North Pacific at that moment, and it's a huge swath of the ocean full of microplastics and big fishing nets. But there are 4 other subtropical gyres, these rotating currents. The entire North Atlantic is a gyre, and there are 3 in the Southern Hemisphere: South Atlantic, South Pacific, Indian Ocean. So we call our organization the Five Gyres Institute. At that time, there was a lot of unknowns. Everyone was talking about plastic pollution. We thought, okay, there's not enough science to back up these claims. This dialogue needs an input of facts. So we began sailing around the world. What is the problem? Where is the plastic? What kind of plastic trash is it? And what's the impact that it's having? And that allows us then to make some really good decisions. So the Five Gyres Institute is about science to solutions in the plastic pollution space. Then the other organization we've created called Leap Lab is a network of science centers that we propose. We have 15 acres here in Ventura County, California. We bought a building in Lusk, Wyoming, in the eastern part of the state. It's the least populated county in the least populated state. The entire county is population 2,400 people. But It's a major thoroughfare to Yellowstone and beyond. So it gets a lot of people. It's a great place for a small museum. It's also where I've been digging dinosaurs for about 25 years. And the third site is actually a buddy I was in the Marines with in Florida. Leap Lab Florida is going to really focus on food security and agriculture. So the idea of Leap Lab is to create this network of centers, science centers, really focus on science literacy and urgent needs in the community where it exists. I used to work for the LA Zoo, the LA County Museum of Natural History, and I had a frustration that we weren't actually doing things that mattered to the people that live there. Mm. And as you've seen in your life, population has doubled worldwide. The resource scarcity, pollution, there are issues that are on the forefront of humanity that we need to address. So the idea of a science center, much more progressive, looking at what are the problems here locally and how do we address them. So It's food security. Yeah. So food security in Florida, in Wyoming, it's science literacy and natural history. And then here in California, we're looking at science literacy, food resilience, and sustainability at large.
Wow. Well, so just to put some data around your observation about population, I listened to an interview you did once, and you said that, when you were born in 1960, there were 4 billion people on the planet. And as of the time of that interview, which was 2016, there were 8 billion. And I think we're up to 9 billion now.
We're still just around 8. It was about 7.8 billion, probably 5-6 years ago, and we're very quickly creeping up. It'll be 9 by end of this decade. And that, if you look at the UN population estimates, they estimate that by the third quarter of this century, we'll begin to taper off around 11.5 billion people. And I think a lot, I have a daughter who's 9 years old. She'll be 88 by the turn of next century. Wow. And I wonder, what is life going to be like for her and her generation, and the obligation that we have, and that kind of what's motivated this network of science centers. Just such a need for science literacy to really understand and solve the problems on the front burner for humanity, for all of us, need to be addressed by all of us voting and acting with common facts, with common knowledge.
Yeah, it is kind of frightening to me that there just is so little. I mean, my parents were both scientists. So my dad was an organic chemist, and he did food chemistry, and then found a passion for selenium tellurium chemistry. Could you think of anything more obscure? But it's a really important chemical, apparently, selenium. And my mom was a microbiologist, so I grew up steeped in, you don't just accept. You don't do your research on Facebook and that's science, right? That's not how it works.
Exactly. If anything, that takes you down a rabbit hole, and who knows what biases are gonna set themselves in, change your position on things.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think now we're seeing the erosion of at least our society from largely the lack of common knowledge.
Well, and trust, I think people
Yes.
feel that they've been,
They
there's
say change
evidence
moves at
that,
the pace of trust.
I beg your pardon?
They say change moves at the pace of trust.
Exactly. And I think it's a huge concern, and people don't know what facts to believe, because it's not quite clear, what's an authoritative statement of fact. But you had a recent paper in a scientific journal, I forget the name of it, but looking at, was it the Antarctic or pollution at the poles, that kind of thing?
Yes, there was one on the Arctic we published. We had two publications last year, complete opposite parts of the world. One was looking at plastic in polar regions,
Mm-hmm.
in the Arctic and Antarctica, and the other was looking at plastics in deserts. Complete opposite biome, middle of nowhere. We were finding, camel skeletons. I had a chance to go to Dubai, and I was going to study plastics in the Gulf of Arabia, and I brought my ocean-going nets to scoop the surface of the water. And I met a veterinarian and said, "You got to come see this." We went 60 miles into the desert, and this is not far from Kuwait. It was so nostalgic for me to be in a different part of the world, a whole different mission. But then we get this pile of bones, and in the chest cavity, like all the ribs sticking up like a basket,
This
I
is a
found
camel.
40-pound, yes, a camel, a 40-pound mass of plastic bags, all adhered, cemented together in that camel's stomach.
Wow.
And we published that paper. We estimated a 2% mortality rate of that population due to just plastic bags.
Well, and you have a Washington Post op-ed just a few months ago with pictures. So if people are interested, check it out. It's a pretty damning view, because all that plastic means they can't eat, right? They can't.
Exactly. Well, it creates a false sense of satiation. It also creates a very toxic environment. Bacteria just grow in the folds of the plastic.
Mm-hmm.
There are lacerations and other illnesses that happen from that. So it's a horrible way to die. Like, imagine if you had 10 plastic bags and 100 bottle caps in your stomach and they never left. You would just be miserable until you eventually succumb to those injuries.
Mm-hmm.
So, the purpose of that paper, and the one before in the Arctic, there was one photograph in that article where we photographed a candy bar wrapper frozen to an iceberg. And both of these research papers, kind of the subtext here, what we're trying to do is publish works that can lend themselves to a change. Maybe in Dubai there could be new regulations around plastic bags, or reusables, or better containment systems, better waste management. But it becomes actionable when the facts say, look, you have a major problem. It's very targeted plastic bags, deal with that. Mm-hmm. In the Arctic, observing those candy wrappers, likely it could be tourist waste or something floating there from far away. Can we reinvent the material? So we don't have this legacy of trash from, 10 minutes you enjoy a candy bar, but the wrapper can float for thousands of miles and stick around for hundreds of years. There's a better way. Mm-hmm. So, it's interesting. I had this conversation yesterday about how science is done. I had many colleagues who are academics, and there's a publisher parish. How many papers can you get out? They call the LPU, the least publishable unit, to get one paper out there. There's another paper that's like it, but publishing on another bit of information. Or there's what we have done, what I find NGOs do. You look for impact. Mm-hmm. So while I don't publish as much, I look for those papers that are going to have impact. Like we discovered plastic microbeads in the Great Lakes.
Oh, I wanted to ask you about that.
Yeah, so that was an example of looking at, what kind of research is going to drive impact. I don't care about the number of publications. I want the ones that are going to actually do something. Mm-hmm. And that was one that really had an impact.
Mm-hmm. Well, what I thought, just to kind of get people familiar with the dates here. So in 2013, you had the first, I would say, major PR kind of push on people's awareness that this was even an issue. And it resulted in a law that was passed by 2015, so 2 years later, that's pretty accelerated when you come from sort of awareness of a phenomenon to actually a legislative remedy. And maybe talk about what that 2 years was like for you.
It was pretty amazing. So my colleague Sam Mason teaches in New York. She she and I had talked about, where else besides the oceans can we look? Because in the oceans, the middle of the ocean, it's a tragedy of the commons. You find a handful of plastic snow, this particulate confetti, and you can't point to a country. It's hard to point to a company. It's so degraded. So you can say, look how bad this jar of trash looks, and it's middle of the oceans, and animals are being injured. But it's hard to get something done. But in the Great Lakes, so okay, let's apply our ocean methods there, and we found thousands of little small. Imagine like a grain of sand, but perfectly round. It could be purple, blue, or orange, little tiny spheres rolling around inside of our sieves. And I had a hunch what they might be, because there's some other folks talking about the discovery of polyethylene little micro beads in like facial scrubs, even toothpastes.
Oh,
There were
wow.
some folks talking about it, and then I thought, wow, we have the smoking gun. This is important. Now we can get the facts. We can get the science of the abundance and distribution of these things in this great freshwater ecosystem in North America.
Mhm.
And we did. We published that paper in 2013. Sam Mason, she had access to a scanning electron microscope, got some really good photographs, did the chemistry, really good science to say, this is what it is. It even matched. We can go to your local pharmacy off the shelf. You could match. Okay, here is a little tiny orange bead. Look, this thing is full of orange microbeads. It was a good fingerprint.
Mhm.
And that began a huge collaboration between over 50 NGOs. We got the law school at Tulane University in New Orleans. The law school, they actually dedicated one of their quarterly journals to microplastics and microbeads, and they produced some sample legislation. So now we had 50 organizations sharing photographs, sharing press releases, sharing videos, sharing the science paper, and we had sample legislation. It didn't take long before a couple of senators introduced that bill to then President Obama, and he signed the 2015 Microbead-Free Waters Act. Like you said, accelerated from science to solutions in just 2.5 years.
I mean, that's an amazing story. But what I think is also fascinating is this material, right, was discovered, right? It was scientifically discovered. It had certain properties that attracted manufacturers to making it. And then without really thinking all the way through to the environmental impact, incorporating it in these, consciously incorporating those things in these products without really thinking it all the way through to what would the full life cycle be. And I wonder if that's something that is that something you're working on, or like, because I think a lot of these decisions get made to optimize something locally. They're not made with a view towards over time, where does this all end? And we have such a problem with mispriced environmental impact in this country. And I mean, my friend and colleague Rebecca Henderson talks about this a lot. She says, if you take like enough carbon to power a computer for 10 minutes, maybe that costs, I don't know, 50 cents. But then if you look at the environmental impact, the people in the environmental movement will tell you, oh, that's at least another 50 cents worth of degradation. And then if you look at the public health impact, the people in public health will tell you that's another 50 cents in degradation. But those things never come together in a common price. And capitalist systems don't do well when things aren't priced properly.
You just hit the nail on the head. And this has been something, it's such a complicated mess. Post World War II is when planned obsolescence came into being as a strategy for capitalism to succeed. The idea that you make something not to last for forever, but for a very short time, and you make it either unfashionable or dysfunctional within a few years. A knob falls off your blender today, you replace the whole blender.
Right.
Whereas in the past, you replace just that part. So the idea of planned obsolescence, that created this stepping back away from the negative externalities, the costs to society, the cost to the public health, the cost to the environment. Those externalities, if you can reject those and just have the profit and let the public deal with those,
right,
This experiment of planned obsolescence and not absorbing externalities, that experiment's played out. And now we see the tremendous costs. For example, just in the last few years, China stopped taking our plastic trash. That big externality of poorly designed products that companies making products said, your city will deal with it. Your city, you just recycle it. You can't just bury it or burn it. There's no room for it. We were shipping, surprisingly, in the United States 5 years ago, half of our recycled plastic we thought was recyclable, going in the blue bin, was actually going to China. Half. And they said no more. Surprisingly, half. China said, it's called the national sword. They said, we can't take America's trash anymore. That sent recycle centers across the United States scrambling to figure out where to put the stuff. I remember I was going to city and city giving talks and just hearing from the city managers saying, now we're just taking soda bottles and milk jugs. That's all that there's a market for. Everything else to the landfill. And we're having to taxpayers are paying for it. So I would say to a large degree that we as a public have subsidized poorly designed products for half a century. And now we can't afford it. I know in New Orleans, my hometown, they kind of obliterated their recycling programs post-Katrina. They just couldn't afford it anymore. So there has to be this big shift. And I'm so glad that you brought this up, because that's kind of where the world is heading. I and a few dozen other scientists are advisors to the United Nations on this proposal for a UN treaty to address plastic pollution. And it's really looking at how do we unravel this idea that externalities being foisted on cities and states and the public. How do you incorporate those into the design of products? If you're making a product and you are responsible for the end game of that, the end game of that bottle, that bag, that straw, maybe you look for an alternative material that's not going to cost you down the line, or a better design so that you can easily take that thing apart or repair it. So we're seeing it's interesting, a lot of traction in the capitalist world is looking at models of reuse and repair and restoration. What we had in our burgeoning democracy a century ago, they're coming back. So it's interesting. I've had a chance to review a few startups and give them advice. I am seeing so much innovation in that space. Business models that embrace the reuse economy, or new materials, plastics that come from seaweed. Even I saw one that's made from crustacean shells. They can make a kind of thin film plastic. So the innovation out there it's really amazing. It's actually, I feel more optimistic now than I did a decade ago.
Well, that's great to hear. I think one of the problems with the way that an ordinary person is feeling about the whole environmental crisis, and I think we can all agree it is a crisis. I mean, we're past the point of kind of thinking, oh well, things are going to be fine. I think there's a genuine concern, but it feels so overwhelming, right? It just feels like there's nothing I can do, and so I think I'm very encouraged that you're feeling optimistic that we can bring some of these things into alignment. One of the companies I'm a super fan of, it's based here in New Jersey, is called TerraCycle. And their CEO, I don't know if you know them, but their CEO is a guy named Tom Scasey, and he's an immigrant, and he came here, and one of his first experiences here in America was he was walking down the sidewalk after having recently arrived, and there was like this television sitting on the sidewalk, and it was a big old, vacuum, I don't know, it was vacuum tube, whatever. It was like not the sleek flat screen TV you put on a wall today, but it was like the model, the generation before. But it was a perfectly fine television. And he said at that moment, he thought, wait a minute, this is a country that has so much wealth that people can just put perfectly functioning things out on the pavement to go to a landfill. Like what? And so his company started when he was a student at Princeton, and he was alarmed at all the food waste there. And the inspiration for his business came when he was visiting someone who found out that there were plants that could be nourished by the output of worms that could be consuming this stuff. And so his original business was he very memorably called it, it was based on worm poop. Anyway, TerraCycle has now grown and developed, and they're into all kinds of things. But one of the things they're sponsoring is something called the loop system. I'm sure you're familiar with that.
Yes.
And is that sort of a piece of how you see these solutions evolving?
Very much so. The whole loop system. Keeping things, either the chemicals or the products in a continuous loop of reuse. And if not reuse, then ease of dismantling, by design, so that all the materials can be recovered. So that loop idea, it's growing. So, for example, Tom Zaki and I were actually both judges on this Tom Ford Prize right now, to give a prize to who has the best solution to thin film packaging. Because I can tell you, if you look at all the harm that scientists observe in the world, it's either fishing gear or it's like single-use thin film packaging. Find a solution to that. So the idea of loop, it can either be a technical loop or a biological loop. There are so many biomaterials out there that are now can have the similar properties of your traditional polyethylene, polypropylene thin film, but have the degradation metric if they get lost. They're not going to be that candy bar wrapper stuck in an iceberg. So yeah, the whole loop idea and the reuse economy. We're seeing so many examples of companies that are embracing the reuse business model. There's one called Vessel. They go into a city and they try to get every restaurant, every coffee shop to accept, wash, and reuse the same mug and cup. And it's called Vessel. And the Vessel just thrives throughout the entire community. There's one company called Repack making a reusable mailer, and they're getting some traction. I think either UPS or FedEx is piloting Repack. So you've seen these reuse models. I think that's the direction it has to go, because we're seeing more and more cities don't want to pay for recycling. They can't open more landfills that are filling quickly. Incineration has its own environmental consequences. So I think find the alternative business models that absorb those externalities that you mentioned earlier is where things are headed.
Yeah, well, specifically with respect to plastic bags, you make the observation new plastic is cheaper because we're not pricing in the externalities. And basically, taxpayers cover that cost. And so essentially, the public is subsidizing cheap, single-use, throwaway plastic. And we don't even realize it. I think that's where the communication needs to be made much more clear. Like, do you realize that you're basically subsidizing the profits of these manufacturers of these single-use plastic items?
You are, and like for a plastic bag, I would suggest that you get taxed twice. You get taxed once by the store that has to increase their cost of goods to give you a supposedly free bag, and then you get taxed again by your city, who has to manage that bag as waste. I mean, there are other systems that do work. I think if companies could absorb the true cost of their goods, the life cycle of their goods. If the plastic bag manufacturers, if they had to pay or a fee for the disposal of that bag, they may look for a different material. But one thing that I often get when I speak with the private sector is the resistance to accept any kind of regulation. And I always ask, but there's so many startups, so many innovators and young entrepreneurs that have a novel solution that could work, and they're trying to capture those externalities. But because of that, their costs are higher. Their true cost, doing the right thing, is much higher than their status quo. How are they going to get a footing if the playing field isn't level? So, I wonder, your experience, how do you convince the private sector that leveling the playing field through smart regulation is a good move?
Well, I think you have to, the business case, right, has to be made really clear. And there are some examples. So let's start with one that Rebecca uses a lot. This is Rebecca Henderson from Harvard. And she talks about the clothing supply chain. And there was a lot of investigative reporting that was done looking at companies like Nike, as an example, going all the way to the Southeastern Asian factories, looking at the sweatshop conditions and worse, near slavery conditions were there, children working in these factories, just really horrible situations. A couple of very dramatic incidences, right? There was a plant that caught on fire. And because of the way the owner had structured the building, people couldn't get out and were literally burned alive at work. I mean, it was incredibly dramatic. And companies like Nike look at that and they go, wait a minute, that is not exactly consistent with our brand. And basically what happened was they created a coalition where companies like Nike and other clothing manufacturers had to certify that their clothing was being made in a humane and sustainable way. And I think when you make these things visible, so I think the first challenge really is to sort of say and make the public case for. So here's, Georgia's startup that's part of the Loop system. They're trying to do the right thing in the right way, an evil large multinational corporation is not going along. And I wouldn't put it, I'd be more subtle than that, hopefully, but I think you need to make it visible, and then I think you need to make it personal. People need to care personally. When a person goes into a store and sees a Nike product and the first thing they think of is sweatshops in Bangladesh, that's not a happy buying experience, right? And so I think you need to take it all the way to that reputation. And I always remind corporate leaders, I said, you're given a license to operate by society. And if society at some level comes to the conclusion that what you're doing is not legitimate, that you're going to have to change. And wouldn't it be better if you got ahead of that than had it brought to you? And I think it's tricky, but there are cases where we've seen the incentives line up. And one that you've talked about, which I think is fantastic, is the hole in the ozone story. Maybe if you remember that for us.
Sure. And this actually is where I think the plastic pollution sort of conversation needs to sort of diversify, because it's so complicated. The stories, the precedent of the hole in the ozone layer, it became a big issue, a lot of denial that it was happening until the science made it very clear. And that took at least a decade of really good science happening. Funding began to flow to science. It got done. And the world scientists said, okay, here's a problem. It's CFCs. That's the issue. And policymakers could rally onto that one very focused silver bullet and ban CFCs worldwide. And we watched the ozone layer begin to close. It's very much a success story, but it was focused. Same for, let's say, smog over cities. In the 1970s in Los Angeles, you couldn't see, the sky. At least horizontally, your airplane would land at LAX and the skyline would disappear with all the smog. And it was very much zeroed in, okay, this is emissions. So emissions controls on cars and smokestacks happened, and largely, urban centers began to clear up. Same for tar floating on the ocean surface. When I was a kid in Louisiana, we'd go to the beach. You'd step in tar all the time. We brought fingernail polish remover to the beach to clean our feet of tar. But that was largely because of oil tankers would discharge their oil, then go offshore and rinse out the sludge in their tanks into the ocean. Once again, very targeted, a mitigation strategy, make that illegal, maritime law. So these three examples, we were able to find a focused intervention that had huge impact. With plastic pollution, I've been at this almost 20 years now, and I can tell you there are so many different sectors that are using and making products, and these are different chemistry, different polymers, different design of products, different uses in society, different ways that they get lost in the environment, different environments they get lost to, different impacts they might have. There's no single solution. It's got to be, you got to deconstruct the complexity of this issue. So what I'm working on right now is a proposal to break it down to 17 sectors, like textiles is one, fishing gear is one, single-use plastics, car tires, hospital waste. All these things are different ways, different polymers. If you can find the target solution in each sector, then you have a chance to mitigate that problem in that space. And then go to the next one. Right now, when I go to conferences, the last 10, 15 years, it's like the Tower of Babel, where I'll be seeing someone talking about fishing gear next to me, someone talking about old T-shirts and textiles across this plastic bag conversation. It's apples and oranges and grapes, and it's just totally different conversations. So I think if we can decentralize, we'll deconstruct the complexity, we'll get to a very focused area that we can then apply some very targeted solutions.
Well, and then what I would say is you want to enlist you were asking about how you get business people on board with this. I think if they know that they're under a microscope, they're going to be a lot more prepared to have a conversation than if it's just part of this general muck and, oh, everybody does it. And, why should you single us out and blah, 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 blah. And I think there is an opportunity there to begin to raise awareness. And, most corporate types are not evil. They don't wake up in the morning saying, I'm going to make all these decisions that are going to degrade the environment. But I think there's a big chunk of them that probably don't even think about it. They're not aware, right? So there's an awareness challenge. And then I think there's a big chunk of them that are like, well, I agree, but we all have to agree. Like, I'm not going to put my company at a cost disadvantage by being environmentally responsible unless you're requiring the same thing of my competitors. And so I think there is, and I get that, you're not going to single-handedly volunteer to be the one that stands out, with a few startling exceptions. Companies like Patagonia come to mind. But by and large, you want to be on some kind of level competitive playing field, which is why I think legislation and, something that creates the rules is really important. I want to spend a minute just on the tragedy of the commons, because people may not know that concept. And it basically says that, and it comes from, I think, English law, where, there was a pasture and nobody really owned it, but everybody was free to use it. And so what ended up happening was the pasture was overgrazed and overused, and eventually became useless to everyone because it was so much overuse. And that was really at the beginning of what caused property laws to be necessary. So you regulated how that pasture could be used, and you adjusted it based on its ability to sustain life. And when it comes to the global environmental crisis with respect to things like plastic, we really are looking at a tragedy of the commons. And to me, capitalism fails in two conditions. One is where the profit is very, very narrowly earned, but the costs are very widely borne. So data privacy would be another example, but it's certainly the environment. So, if I'm a company, I won't name them, but if I'm a company that makes my money because I'm sucking up everybody's personal data, but the individual cost to each person is relatively small, capitalism kind of can't figure that out. And the other one is where nobody can actually pinpoint the true costs and benefits of a particular ecosystem, right? And that's where I think you have to have policymakers step in, because otherwise, you're left to individuals doing the right thing, and that never works. Not that they want to do badly, but you can't depend on goodwill to carry the day.
Sure. I would I'd love to just engage for a second this conversation we're talking about right now around the idea of textiles. So we are considering an expedition textile focused. And like you said, zeroing in on that one sector, not make it so amorphous and big, but zeroing in, bring attention to that. We're going to sail from Los Angeles to San Francisco and back, changing crews 3 times. We want to bring corporate leaders on board, policymakers, scientists, and students, and just have this conversation, textile focused, and think about how do we, the first conversation was, which part of textiles we want to zero in on even further? Is it textiles used like in tarps and sails and covers for whatever? Or is it going to be clothing? Which part of clothing is it? We zeroed in on fast fashion as being the most polluting part of the whole textile space. And then trying to think, where in that space, how do we engage? Who do we engage? And it gets so complex quick. It gets complicated very quickly, as a lot of fast fashion comes from overseas. A lot of fast fashion is made locally in a lot of mom and pop shops. This is where we struggle a bit to know where is the silver bullet. What kind of policy might we look for? We look for an extended producer responsibility model, where if you're making it, maybe not the producer of the textile, the fiber itself, but the manufacturer of the finished product. That's where the responsibility needs to happen. So we're not quite sure.
Yeah. So with fast fashion, I have a couple of hypotheses about this. So if So the first piece of data that I find stunning is a colleague of mine calls it fashion bulimia, which is you buy an article of clothing, you wear it twice, and then it goes to a landfill, right? Which is, not great.
Exactly.
And what she found was that if you looked at the turn of the century, so 1900, the average woman owned something like 5 pieces of clothing and wore them a couple of hundred times, before they were replaced. Today, that's reversed. You own a couple of hundred pieces of clothing and you wear them 5 times. And, I think it's a fascinating statistic. But I actually trace a lot of the interest in fast fashion to the conjunction of cameras and cell phones. And that started, the very first cell phones that had cameras started in about 2003. And the target of these phones was often teenagers, and if you think about what does clothing do for teenagers, a lot of it is communication. And so once you had cameras, now there's this incentive to have a different outfit every time you're in a picture. So what you really want is clothing like that disappears the minute you take it. So I almost think there's an opportunity to say, if you are in a different outfit every time there's a picture taken of you, that is environmentally irresponsible. And I think you could begin to reverse that narrative. But starting from the demand side, and I think this is another area where I think we struggle, right? Because a lot of what we're trying to do is affect the supply side, do this in a more responsible way. But we're not also looking at the demand side. And so I think there's a number of angles you could take to deal with the demand side of a lot of these issues as well.
I like that. I've never thought of that. I guess I'm
There you
so
go.
far from my teen years, although I'll see it soon in my daughter. She's 9 years old now.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess that
But
generation.
if you think of the companies that really were behind this, so the Zaras and the HSMs and the smaller providers, what they basically said to these teenagers, I mean, not just teenagers, but they honed in on that sort of young demographic. What they basically did was created a model where there was an urgency around purchase. So if you see that pencil skirt, you better buy it today because we may not have more in stock. You saw instant replenishment at the store level, which again was very attractive to the customer. And what Zara in particular did, which is owned by a parent company, they would set up their stores, not set up in strip malls, not like where they would set their stores up right next to, a Bloomingdale's or something. And so they were perceived as this luxury fashion, but at this cheap and cheerful price, with the added urgency of buy it today, it may not be here tomorrow. So they created this entire demand structure, which if you think about the apparel business, it used to be you had 4 seasons, right? And it was all very carefully designed for those 4 seasons. I'm not saying that was great for the environment either, but it was definitely less taxing than the free-for-all we've got now, where it's like continuous replenishment, continuous supply. And I'm just wondering if there isn't something that could be done about the demand side of that, like bring attention to the fact that that pencil skirt you bought, you better plan on keeping that for a while if you're going to be environmentally responsible.
One thought comes to mind. I had a conversation yesterday about the metaverse and avatars in a digital space. If that were where you change your clothes rather than on your physical body, but in your avatar, why buy it when you could show it in a very different way? That'd be an interesting way to influence the demand side.
Well, I think that's something to think about, right? Because I do believe this sort of imagery and Instagram and all that, it's part of this whole package of how we present images of each other. So I was talking to a colleague from Dartmouth the other day about Kodak, and Kodak's, of course, got this canonical story about how it missed the digital revolution, which is actually not true. It got it. It just decided to pin its hopes on printing as the way. And so, they went into high-end printing, which, pictures would be printed and put into albums. Well, no, pictures are no longer printed. They're shown on screens and then they're put on Instagram. And that whole, digital dispossession of the process of printing physical pictures, you could conceive of something like that for how I show up. So, maybe my environmentally responsible thing is I show up in the same black turtleneck all the time, but my avatar could be wonderfully imaginative. I love that idea.
That's really interesting food for thought. My daughter and I, when she's going to school, we'll Zoom before she walks to her classroom. My wife brings her into this class. But when she Zooms, she'll always change her face. There's an option. You can change your image constantly. If we're a little more streamlined, a little more nuanced, where it was actually changing just bits of clothing, That's really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
But
part of it is, and again, back to capitalism, right? If there's no demand for something, people are going to stop making it, regardless of whether it's environmentally sustainable or not. That's like job one, right? And so I think a lot of these demand things are, I think we need to give as much thought to the demand as to the supply side of stuff.
You're absolutely right. And we did that with plastic microbeads. We discovered those in 2013. Part of the campaign was create a gross factor around microbeads. We actually met a dentist that said, and he said, I've been finding plastic microbeads in people's gums for years, and their gum surgery will not heal when a microbead gets stuck in the tissue. And because there are plastic microbeads in toothpastes. We grabbed that story. So it had such a yuck factor, and the public, just their response was, I guess, more than we had hoped for. They were so disgusted by the idea of plastic microbeads. So the material, the product got vilified by the public. And like you're just implying, demand just dropped for toothpastes and facial scrubs containing plastics. Mm-hmm. Scrubbing your face with plastic debris or brushing your teeth with it had this yuck factor to the public. So that did drive demand downward very quickly.
Mm-hmm. And again, I don't think it's to be evil about this, but if you're doing something that ultimately has a far bigger cost to all of us, for the purpose of generating localized profits, I don't think that's out of bounds to say, hey, this is not a good thing, right? And companies will adjust. They'll figure it out if they have to. They'll get very creative and inventive. And this is the other thing that I'm astonished by. I was at a big fancy CEO conference, and Jeff Immelt happened to be there, formerly of GE, and he was talking about how pursuing environmental issues had led them to all these cost savings and personnel savings and ease of use and all these benefits that came because they were under pressure to be more safe for the environment. And I remember him getting grilled by a very feisty BBC reporter who said, "Are you sitting here telling me you weren't paying any attention to those possibilities until somebody got on your case about your environmental footprint?" And he went completely red in the face. But it was true. That's exactly what happened.
Well, if you admit that, perhaps make it easier on-ramping for other CEOs to say, let's just be honest, now we're paying attention.
Well, right. And I think one of the marvelous things about human ingenuity is if you create constraints, and then designers will tell you this, right? If you create constraints, that's where creativity gets unleashed. So yes, you whine about it. You have to spend a little more energy on it, and it's a little bit more expensive. But and you talk about the entrepreneurs, the creativity that gets released when you're faced with some kind of constraint is astonishing. I mean, I would take the enormous creativity that you saw just across corporate world in the early days of the pandemic. I mean, things people would have said 6 months previous could never be done, were impossible, we couldn't afford it, no way. Within 3 months, bang, done. And if we can do that as a species, surely we should be able to figure out how not to, go down with our planet. Right.
Sure. I think we're extremely adaptive to all things. 9/11 is a great example. The pandemic is another example. We shift quickly. We
can. So one thing that you and I talked about when we first met was children and their exposure to the environment. And you were talking about your childhood and how you grew up with swamp creatures and alligators, but very comfortable with, very attuned to the environment, and that so many of our children today just aren't.
I had this conversation yesterday talking about the metaverse, and that kids are creating these avatars and experiencing nature through this two-dimensional screen into a three-dimensional perceived space. And I made the point that, well, then where do they get the connection, the deep connection to the natural world? Because it's so much more than that. I mean, I remember me and my friends, a handful of people, four of us, meet at 7 a.m. on our Saturday morning, backpacks and our machetes and pocket knives, and go walk into the swamp. And it was hot and it was dirty and we were hungry. We were catching animals and we were looking at, and we get rained on. All those experiences built my conservation ethic in a very strong way. I lived in Los Angeles for 25 years, and I used to go visit a lot of schools and give talks. I met so many kids that would be a few miles from the beach and had never seen it. And so those kids are terrified of pigeons and squirrels and urban critters, don't want their feet to touch grass. They're safe on the sidewalk. And that's a term for that, nature deficit disorder. And
Really?
you grow up with that, you become, once you begin voting, you don't have that foundation, that conservation ethic to defend nature. So I think it's integral. It's part of the whole Leap Lab, our new nonprofit sort of premise is to create 5 gyres ocean plastics, that's very global. Leap Lab is very local. How can you work within your community? What are your community's needs? Is it food resilience? Is it access to nature? I'm right now in a farmhouse. This was built in 1890, 15 acres. And we're trying to get our conditional use permit to create a camp so that kids can come out for overnight events. We have an outdoor timeline, natural history, a model solar system. It's going to be a little science refuge, a camp for Ventura County, which has no museum of natural history. It has no zoo, no science center, has 22 school districts and 140,000 students. So we want to create that science center, at least one informal learning space to create outdoor education. Yeah, I believe wholeheartedly it is essential to your development to have access to nature, especially intimate contact with wild nature. There's nothing can replace that. There's no metaverse can replace those relationships.
That's really inspiring that you're doing that. I think that's great. So we're kind of getting towards our final few minutes. How does an ordinary person do something? Like, what's an action someone who's perhaps listening or watching as we replay this? What's something? I mean, I think most people, at least in the US, now I don't think this applies globally, but at least in the US, we kind of go, all right, we've recycled, maybe we've replaced a few light bulbs with LEDs, maybe we stuck some solar panels on our roof. Like, beyond that, is there anything that you would suggest people might want to take action on?
I guess my advice for the individual, and I often get that question, and
I'm sure you do.
I often say, well, it's the onus is also on corporations, also onus on our policymakers, but you as an individual, get organized. Get organized. Find your like-minded people in your neighborhood, in your community, and get organized. There are many local organizations that are doing things. And then look to other cities. Once you organize, what's working elsewhere? Here in Los Angeles, we began a group called Reusable LA, and it's working. We're getting, communities to reject single-use plastics in favor of some of these more reuse systems. So it works in our city, could work somewhere else. So the individual, you're putting your light bulb, recycling your bottle, that's nice, but getting organized, you're gonna have so much more power, so much more impact locally. And
I was astonished to find that in New York City, like who would have thought they've actually got local groups now doing composting. And in New York is a place where you don't even have garbage disposals in New York. So everything goes in the trash. And you go out on trash collection night and it's like heaps of stuff on the sidewalk. But these local neighborhood groups have said, just save, here's a bin, save it once a week, bring it to us and we'll use it for good purposes. Don't put it in a landfill. And I'm thinking to myself, if you could make that work in New York City, you can make that work anywhere.
Yes, it becomes a model that's shareable. So yeah, getting organized, doing something like that, and making sure the world can see it. Use your social media platforms to get the word out there. And others will give you. We get calls all the time about how can I put reusable LA into reusable Cleveland or someplace else.
Oh, nice.
So get organized and then share your expertise, what you learn.
I love
that's
that.
what I advise.
You know what I think is also so fascinating about this is, I see, especially among young people, this just enormous hunger for purpose and connection. And, what better way to foster purpose and connection than meeting with working with like-minded souls on something like that, where it just doesn't have to take over your life, but it builds a community. It gives you something positive to look forward to. It gives you a bit of purpose. And I think people are very hungry for that.
They are very much like, we're going to have an event this evening. We have one city council member here in Santa Paula, population 32,000 people. He's going to come over and bring a dozen other locals to say, what can we do for this community? And how can we take this, what we do here in the city, and model it for the rest of Ventura County? So the conversation is beginning here, but the idea of sharing it more widely. But there's got to be a social component, a network, friend building, relationship development that just makes it joyful.
Yeah.
It's the right thing to do, and it's fun doing it.
I love that. That's absolutely great. So your work, how do people find out more, support you? What do you have a wish list of sorts?
So I guess the two organizations, if you're interested in plastics, check out the Five Gyres Institute and join, become an ambassador. And we will share within our ambassador group, over 1,000 ambassadors, find who are the local people in your neighborhood that you can organize with. We'll give you all the tools you need. If you want to come to our site, also just watch our videos and see what it's like sailing across an ocean. A lot of fun resources there. And then with Leap Lab, we're just getting started with Leap Lab. We got 15 acres here, an acre in Wyoming, and then we're working in Florida. A network of science centers building science literacy to all working the same facts and doing it local, one city at a time is where we're at. So those two sites, there's against the Five Gyres Institute and Leap Lab.
That's great. Well, Marcus, I am so grateful to you for making an hour for me. You've got really important work elsewhere. So I'm at least we can help get the word out about what you're doing. Those listening, do visit Marcus's website. The movies also are totally worth, like these guys on the ocean in a raft made out of junk. I mean, it's pretty impressive how that works. And we didn't even talk about your trip from it was from California to Hawaii. I know that, and that took a lot longer than you expected.
That one, didn't it?
Yeah, we didn't talk about that one. But you can catch up with it on the website and definitely check it out. It's an amazing journey. And Marcus, you're just such an amazing person. I feel very privileged to get to know you. So thank you.
Oh, likewise. I'm so glad we had a chance to talk today.
To be continued.
And you're welcome to Leap Lab Farms anytime.
Oh, lovely. Okay. Thanks, guys. Bye, everybody.